the courtroom camera captured something that would make 200 million people across the internet ugly cry into their screens and question everything they thought they knew about justice in America. Samuel Torres, a 71-year-old disabled veteran with a prosthetic left leg, a faded army jacket covered in combat patches, and hands that still trembled from decades-old shrapnel wounds, shuffled through Judge Judy's courtroom doors, using a worn wooden cane that looked like it had been with him since Vietnam. His silver hair was neatly combed despite everything life had thrown at him, his posture still carrying traces of military discipline even as his body betrayed him with every painful step. What happened in the next 38 minutes would become the single most emotional moment ever broadcast on daytime television. Shared over 200 million times, covered by every major news outlet from CNN to the BBC, discussed in Congress. But here's what makes this story absolutely soul-crushing. Samuel didn't walk into that courtroom looking for money, he didn't want revenge, he didn't care about winning or losing his case. What Samuel Torres carried in the inside pocket of that faded army jacket was a handwritten letter from his wife Margaret, who had died of cancer 14 months earlier. A letter that contained a secret so powerful, so devastating, and so heartbreaking that when Judge Judy read it out loud, she did something that no one in 25 years of television had ever seen her do. She left the bench, she walked down from her elevated position of authority, and she did something that would make the toughest, most hardened viewers in America break down and weep. But before we get to that letter and the moment that shattered Judge Judy's famous composure, I need you to do something for me right now. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've ever known a veteran who deserved better from the country they fought to protect. Hit that subscribe button immediately, because what you're about to witness isn't just a court case. It's a testament to love, sacrifice, and the kind of injustice that should make every American furious. The moment Judge Judy reads that letter out loud is the most powerful thing you'll ever see on a screen. I promise you that, and I need you to stay until the very end, because what happens after the letter is read changes Samuel's life in a way that nobody, not even Samuel himself, could have predicted. Samuel Torres had served 3 tours in Vietnam between 1969 and 1974. He had been a staff sergeant in the 101st Airborne Division, leading a platoon of 30 men through some of the most brutal jungle combat in American military history. He had earned a Bronze Star for valor, a Purple Heart for the landmine that took his left leg or below the knee, and a Presidential Unit Citation that he kept in a shoebox under his bed because he said the men who deserved it never came home to receive theirs. After coming home from Vietnam, Samuel had struggled like so many veterans of that era. No parades, no thank yous, no support systems. Just nightmares, a missing leg, and a country that wanted to forget the war and everyone who fought in it. He bounced between jobs, fought alcoholism, and spent 2 years sleeping in his car in a VA hospital parking lot, because the waiting list for veteran housing was 18 months long. Then he met Margaret. Margaret Ellen Chen, a nurse at the VA hospital in Phoenix, Arizona, had found Samuel sitting alone in the hospital cafeteria at 3 in the morning during one of her overnight shifts. He was 34 years old, homeless, missing a leg, and trying to eat a cup of soup with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She sat down across from him without being invited, and according to Samuel, the first thing she ever said to him was, "Your soup is getting cold, soldier," and that was the moment he decided to keep living. They married 8 months later in the VA hospital chapel with 12 other veterans as witnesses. For the next 37 years, Margaret and Samuel built a life together in a small 2-bedroom house in Mesa, Arizona that Margaret had purchased with her nursing salary. Samuel eventually got work as a janitor at a local elementary school, a job he held for 28 years and loved because the children didn't care about his prosthetic leg and thought his war stories were the most exciting things they'd ever heard. Margaret continued nursing at the VA hospital for 32 years, caring for veterans who reminded her of the broken man she had found in that cafeteria decades ago. They never had children. Margaret couldn't, a fact that had broken her heart, but that Samuel had addressed by telling her that she mothered every veteran who walked through those hospital doors, and that was more than enough for any lifetime. They lived quietly, modestly, and happily in that little house in Mesa, 2 people who had found each other when the world had given up on both of them. Then 3 years ago, Margaret was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was 6 months. She lasted 14 months through sheer willpower, and what Samuel called pure Irish stubbornness, despite the fact that she was Chinese American. During those 14 months, while Samuel was caring for her around the clock, something happened that would lead directly to this courtroom appearance. Their neighbor, a man named Derek Ashland, a 45-year-old property developer who had moved into the neighborhood 2 years earlier, began a systematic campaign to acquire Samuel and Margaret's property. Derek Ashland had purchased 6 houses on their street through his development company, Ashland Premier Properties, and was planning to demolish them all to build a luxury condominium complex worth an estimated $12 million. Samuel and Margaret's house sat right in the middle of his planned development site, and he needed their property to make the project work. Derek had started with offers, reasonable ones at first, then increasingly aggressive ones, then threatening letters from attorneys, then code violation complaints filed against the Torres property, complaints about a fence that was 2 inches too tall, a tree branch that extended 6 inches over the property line, a mailbox that was allegedly 3 inches too close to the sidewalk. While Margaret was dying of cancer in the bedroom they had shared for 37 years, Derek Ashland filed 14 separate code violation complaints against their property in 8 months. Each complaint required Samuel to appear at City Hall to contest it, taking him away from Margaret's bedside. Each complaint cost money to fight. Each complaint was designed to pressure a dying woman and her disabled veteran husband into selling their home so that Derek Ashland could add another zero to his net worth. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in October, with Samuel holding her hand and reading to her from the book of poems she had kept on her nightstand since their wedding day. 3 weeks after Margaret's funeral, before Samuel had even finished grieving, before the flowers on her grave had wilted, Derek Ashland showed up at Samuel's front door with a new offer. This time it wasn't even an offer really. It was an ultimatum. Derek told Samuel that the property was now worth significantly less without Margaret's income contributing to the mortgage, that the code violations would result in fines that Samuel couldn't afford on his veterans' disability payments, and that if Samuel didn't sell within 30 days, Derek would file a lawsuit claiming that Samuel's property was a neighborhood nuisance and seek a court order to force the sale. Samuel, 71 years old, grieving his wife of 37 years, standing on a prosthetic leg in the doorway of the only home he'd ever known with his wife, told Derek Ashland to get off his property. Derek filed the lawsuit the next day seeking $85,000 in damages for alleged property devaluation caused by Samuel's home and a court order compelling the sale. Samuel Torres, who had survived Vietnam, survived homelessness, survived decades of PTSD and had just buried the love of his life, was now being sued by a millionaire property developer who wanted to tear down his house and replace it with luxury condominiums, and the only lawyer Samuel could afford was a free legal aid attorney who had 47 other cases and could barely remember Samuel's name. That's when someone at the legal aid office suggested Judge Judy's show. They said the exposure might help Samuel's case, might bring public attention to what Derek was doing. Samuel didn't want attention. He didn't want to be on television. He was a private man who had spent 37 years living quietly with the woman he loved. But he was about to lose his home, the last place Margaret had been alive, the walls that still smelled like her perfume, the kitchen where she had made him coffee every morning for 37 years, and he had no other options. So Samuel Torres, Bronze Star recipient, Purple Heart veteran, widower and target of a predatory property developer, agreed to appear on Judge Judy, and he brought Margaret's letter with him. Judge Judy Scheindlin had been reviewing Samuel Torres' case file for 3 days before the taping, and what she found in those documents didn't just make her angry. It made her absolutely furious in a way that her staff said they had never seen before in 25 years of working with her. She had seen greed before. She had seen powerful people exploit vulnerable ones. She had seen every variety of human cruelty parade through her courtroom in thousands of cases spanning decades. But something about this case, about a millionaire developer harassing a dying woman and her disabled veteran husband to steal their home, struck a nerve so deep that Judge Judy had her research team spend 3 full days investigating Derek Ashland's background, his business practices, his previous lawsuits, and every single code violation complaint he had filed against the Torres property. What they found was damning. What they uncovered was a pattern of predatory behavior that went far beyond Samuel and Margaret's case. What Judge Judy prepared for this taping would go beyond rendering a simple judgment. She was going to dismantle Derek Ashland's entire operation on national television and make an example out of him that every predatory developer in America would never forget. But even Judge Judy, with all her years of experience, with all her legendary toughness, with all her famous emotional control, was not prepared for what was inside Margaret Torres's letter. Nobody was. The courtroom carried an unusual energy that morning, heavier than normal, charged with something that the production staff would later describe as a feeling that something historic was about to happen. The audience settled into their seats with quiet anticipation. The cameras were positioned and focused. The stage was set for what everyone assumed would be a standard property dispute case. Then Samuel Torres entered the courtroom, and the energy shifted entirely. He moved slowly, his wooden cane tapping against the floor in a rhythm that seemed to match the quiet beating of every heart in the room. His faded army jacket hung slightly loose on a frame that had been shrinking with age and grief. His combat patches were visible even from the back rows of the audience. His prosthetic leg clicked softly with each step, a mechanical reminder of the price he had paid for his country decades ago. He didn't look at the cameras, he didn't look at the audience. He looked straight ahead with the focused discipline of a man who had been trained to walk through hostile territory without showing fear. Several audience members later said they felt their eyes sting before the case even began. There was something about Samuel Torres, something in the way he carried himself, that communicated a lifetime of sacrifice and suffering without a single word being spoken. Derek Ashland entered from the opposite side looking like he had walked out of a luxury real estate catalog. Tailored navy blue suit, silk tie, gold cufflinks that caught the studio lights, Italian leather shoes that probably cost more than Samuel's monthly disability check. He was 45 years old, tanned, confident, and wearing the expression of a man who believed that money made him untouchable, and that this television appearance was merely an inconvenience on his way to closing a $12 million deal. He sat down at his table, arranged his documents with practiced efficiency, and barely glanced at the elderly veteran across the aisle. To Derek Ashland, Samuel Torres wasn't a person, he was an obstacle, a speed bump on the road to profit, an old man who was too stubborn to take the money and disappear. Judge Judy's entrance was met with the usual respectful silence, but today her expression carried something extra. Something that veteran court watchers would recognize as barely contained fury hiding behind judicial composure. She sat, arranged her own documents, and looked at both parties with eyes that were already making judgments that neither party would enjoy. Mr. Ashland, Judge Judy began, her voice carrying that trademark precision that could make a confident man feel like a schoolboy caught cheating. You filed a lawsuit against Mr. Torres claiming that his property constitutes a neighborhood nuisance and is devaluing your adjacent properties. You're seeking $85,000 in damages and a court order compelling the sale of his home. Tell me about these code violations you've been filing. Derek straightened his tie and launched into his prepared presentation with the polished confidence of someone who had pitched multi-million-dollar deals to investors and city councils. Your Honor, I have extensive documentation showing that Mr. Torres' property has been in violation of numerous city codes for an extended period. The fence height, the tree maintenance, the mailbox placement, the condition of the driveway. These violations collectively have created a property that is bringing down values in the entire neighborhood and interfering with legitimate development plans that will benefit the community. He opened a leather portfolio containing photographs and documents organized with corporate precision. I've invested significant capital in revitalizing this neighborhood. I've purchased and renovated 6 properties. I'm planning a development that will create jobs, increase tax revenue, and provide modern housing. Mr. Torres' property in its current condition is the sole impediment to progress that will benefit everyone. Judge Judy listened to this presentation with an expression that resembled a cat watching a mouse explain why it should be allowed to leave the trap. When Derek finished, she turned to Samuel. Mr. Torres, what's your response? Samuel's voice was quiet but steady, carrying the measured cadence of a man who had learned decades ago that words matter and shouldn't be wasted. Your Honor, that house is my home. It's been my home for 36 years. My wife Margaret and I bought it together when we got married. She died there 14 months ago. She died in our bedroom. Her clothes are still in the closet, her coffee mug is still on the counter where she left it the last morning she could get out of bed. He paused, his jaw tightening with the effort of controlling emotions that threatened to surface. While my wife was dying, this man was sending us code violation notices about a fence being 2 inches too tall. While I was holding Margaret's hand and watching the woman I loved disappear a little more each day, I was getting threatening letters from his attorneys telling me to sell my home. I couldn't be with her every moment she needed me because I had to go to City Hall to fight his complaints. Left her side to argue about a mailbox, Your Honor. I left my dying wife alone to argue about a mailbox. The courtroom had gone completely silent. Several audience members were already wiping their eyes. A production assistant standing off camera had to turn away to compose herself. Samuel's words weren't dramatic or performed. They were plain and honest and devastating in their simplicity. Judge Judy's expression had shifted from judicial composure to something harder, something dangerous, directed entirely at Derek Ashland, who was beginning to realize that his polished presentation might not be playing as well as he had anticipated. Mr. Ashland, Judge Judy said, her voice dropping to that quiet register that regular viewers knew meant someone was about to be verbally destroyed. When did you first approach the Torres family about purchasing their property? Derek cleared his throat. Approximately 2 years ago, we made several generous offers, well above market value. They refused everyone. A business is a business, Your Honor. I can't let one person's sentimentality hold up a project that benefits an entire community. Judge Judy's eyes narrowed. Sentimentality. You call a veteran's attachment to the home where his wife died sentimentality. Derek realized his word choice had been catastrophic but pressed forward with the confidence of someone who had never been truly held accountable in his life. With all due respect, Your Honor, emotional attachment to property doesn't exempt someone from code compliance. The violations are documented. The impact on property values is documented. My position is legally sound regardless of Mr. Torres' personal circumstances. Judge Judy pulled a thick folder from beneath her bench, and the temperature in the courtroom seemed to drop 15 degrees. Let's talk about those code violations, Mr. Ashland. I had my research team look into every single complaint you filed against the Torres property. All 14 of them. Derek's confidence flickered for the first time. I also had them look into your other properties and your development company's history. Care to guess what they found? Derek's attorney whispered something in his ear, but Derek waved him off with the arrogance of a man who still believed his money and connections made him bulletproof. I'm sure everything is in order, Your Honor. My company operates within all legal parameters. Judge Judy's smile was thin and absolutely merciless. Really? Then perhaps you can explain why 11 of the 14 code violations you filed against Mr. Torres were dismissed by the city as frivolous. The remaining 3 involved infractions so minor that they typically result in a written warning, not formal complaints. A fence 2 inches over height limit, a tree branch extending 6 inches past a property line, a mailbox 3 inches from its mandated position. She held up a document for the cameras. I also found that you filed similar patterns of frivolous code violations against 4 other homeowners on that street before they sold to you. One of those homeowners, a 78-year-old widow named Mrs. Gladys Palmer, sold her home to you for $40,000 below market value after you filed 9 code violations against her property in 4 months. The courtroom murmured with growing anger directed at Derek, who was now sitting straighter in his chair, his tanned face showing the first signs of genuine alarm. Judge Judy continued pulling out more documents. Another homeowner, a single mother named Lisa Hernandez, sold after you had her driveway cited for a crack that your own construction vehicles had caused when doing renovations on the adjacent property you'd already purchased. She sold to you at a $35,000 loss because she couldn't afford the legal fees to fight you. Derek's attorney was now actively trying to intervene. Your Honor, these other transactions are not relevant to the current case. Judge Judy turned her gaze on the attorney with enough force to make him physically lean back in his chair. They are absolutely relevant because they establish a pattern of predatory behavior designed to pressure vulnerable homeowners into selling their properties below market value so your client can demolish their homes and build luxury condominiums. That's not development, counselor. That's extortion with a real estate license. The courtroom energy had shifted completely. What had started as a property dispute was being revealed as a systematic campaign of predatory property acquisition that targeted elderly people, single mothers, and now a disabled veteran whose wife had been dying of cancer. The audience's sympathy for Samuel Torres was now matched by their fury toward Derek Ashland, who was discovering in real time that his polished confidence was worth nothing in the face of thorough investigation and righteous judicial anger. Derek attempted to regain control. Your Honor, I am a legitimate businessman. I create value, I build communities. I can't help it if some property owners are more emotionally attached to their homes than is financially rational. The moment those words left his mouth, the courtroom reacted as if he had slapped an elderly person across the face. Audience members shook their heads in visible disgust. Judge Judy's expression transformed into something that could have frozen lava. Financially rational, she repeated, her voice carrying 35 years of judicial experience and the full weight of her contempt. You're telling a 71-year-old disabled veteran that his attachment to the home where his wife of 37 years died of cancer is financially irrational. Mr. Ashland, I've met a lot of terrible people in this courtroom. I've dealt with liars, cheats and frauds of every description. But I want you to know that in 25 years behind this bench, I have rarely encountered anyone whose moral bankruptcy is as complete and shameless as yours. Derek's attorney stood up. Your Honor, I must object to the characterization of my client. Judge Judy didn't even look at him. Sit down, counselor. Your objection is noted and overruled. And if I were you, I'd start thinking carefully about whether I wanted to continue representing a client whose business practices might constitute a pattern of elder abuse and predatory property acquisition. The attorney sat down immediately and did not speak again for the remainder of the proceedings. Judge Judy turned back to Samuel Torres, and her expression softened in a way that viewers rarely saw. The transition from fury to gentleness was so dramatic that several audience members would later describe it as the most human moment they had ever witnessed from the famously tough judge. Mr. Torres, I understand you brought something with you today. Something your wife left for you. Samuel's hand moved instinctively to the inside pocket of his faded army jacket. He touched the pocket gently, as if confirming that what was inside was still there, still safe, still real. His fingers trembled against the fabric, and for the first time since entering the courtroom, his military composure showed cracks. Deep cracks that revealed the grief underneath. Yes, Your Honor. Margaret wrote me a letter. She wrote it during her last week. The nurse found it in Margaret's pillowcase after she passed. It was addressed to me, and there was a second page addressed to whoever might be able to help. Samuel's voice cracked on the word help, and he took a moment to steady himself. His jaw clenched, his eyes glistened but didn't overflow. He was a soldier, and soldiers maintained composure. Even when everything inside them was shattering. I've been carrying it with me since she died. I sleep with it under my pillow where she kept it. I've read it so many times the paper is getting soft around the edges. I almost didn't bring it today, because I was afraid something might happen to it. It's all I have left of her voice. Judge Judy's own composure shifted almost imperceptibly. Those who knew her well could see the slight change in her breathing, the way her hands pressed flat against the bench as if steadying herself. After 25 years of maintaining judicial distance from the emotions that paraded through her courtroom daily, something about Samuel Torres and his dead wife's letter was penetrating armor that had withstood thousands of cases and millions of tears. Would you be willing to share it with the court, Mr. Torres? You don't have to. This is entirely your choice. Samuel reached into his jacket pocket with both trembling hands and withdrew a folded piece of paper. It was lined notebook paper, the kind you buy in any drugstore, and even from a distance, the cameras could see that it had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases were wearing thin. The handwriting visible on the outside fold was shaky, written by a hand weakened by months of chemotherapy and the slow surrender of a body losing its fight. Samuel held the letter for a moment, pressing it against his chest, his eyes closing briefly in what might have been a prayer or simply a moment of connection with the woman who had written those words. Then he unfolded it carefully, reverently, the way a person handles something sacred. Your Honor, I'd like you to read it. I don't think I can get through it out loud. My voice won't hold. The bailiff carried the letter to Judge Judy with unusual care, handling it as though it were made of glass rather than paper. Judge Judy received it with both hands, and as she began to read the first line silently, something changed in her face. The famous toughness, the legendary composure, the judicial armor she wore like a second skin began to dissolve. Her lips pressed together, her chin moved almost imperceptibly, her eyes moved across Margaret Torres's shaky handwriting, and for the first time in 25 years of television, Judge Judy Scheindlin's eyes filled with tears. The courtroom held its breath. Nobody moved, nobody whispered. Even Derek Ashland sat frozen, sensing that something was happening that transcended property disputes and code violations and $12 million development deals. Judge Judy looked up from the letter, directly at Samuel Torres, and her voice when she spoke was different from anything anyone had ever heard from her. It was soft, it was broken, it was human in a way that the tough, quick-witted television judge never allowed herself to be. Mr. Torres, may I read this aloud? The world should hear your wife's words. Samuel nodded, unable to speak, his hand gripping his wooden cane so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Judge Judy began reading, and the words that filled the courtroom were the last words of Margaret Ellen Torres, written in a dying hand, carrying a love so powerful that it reached beyond the grave and into the hearts of every single person in that room. My dearest Samuel, if you're reading this, then I've gone ahead without you, and I'm sorry for that. I promised you 37 years ago in that little chapel that I would never leave you, and I've broken that promise, and I need you to forgive me for it. Judge Judy's voice wavered but continued. You were sitting alone in a cafeteria with a cup of cold soup and hands that wouldn't stop shaking, and I thought you were the most beautiful man I'd ever seen. Not because of how you looked, but because of what I could see behind your eyes. I saw a man who had walked through fire for strangers and was wondering if anyone would ever walk through anything for him. I decided right then that I would walk through everything for you. And I have, and it has been the greatest honor of my life. The tears were flowing freely now, not just from Judge Judy, but from every single person in the courtroom. Camera operators wiped their eyes while keeping their cameras steady through pure professional discipline. The bailiff stood with his back to the audience, his shoulders shaking. Derek Ashland sat motionless, his expensive suit suddenly looking obscene in the presence of this naked honest grief. I know about the man next door. I know what he wants. I know about the letters and the complaints and the pressure to make us leave our home. I know you've been hiding it from me to protect me, and I love you for that, but Samuel, I always knew. I could hear you on the phone arguing with lawyers when you thought I was sleeping. I could see the envelopes you hid in your jacket before bringing me my morning tea. You thought you were protecting me from worry. But you were carrying it all alone, and that breaks my heart more than the cancer ever could. Judge Judy had to pause. She removed her glasses and pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment that stretched into an eternity of silence. When she continued, her voice was barely above a whisper, but the courtroom was so silent that every word carried to the furthest corner of the room. This is the second page. Margaret addressed it to anyone who might be able to help Samuel. To whoever reads this. My name is Margaret Torres. I'm a nurse. I spent 32 years caring for veterans at the VA hospital in Phoenix, men and women who gave parts of their bodies and parts of their souls to protect this country. My husband is one of those people. He gave his legs in Vietnam. He gave years of his life to nightmares. He gave his youth to a war that his country asked him to fight and then tried to forget. All he ever got in return was a prosthetic leg, a disability check that barely covers groceries, and a little house in Mesa, Arizona, where I could love him and make him feel like the hero he is. Now someone wants to take that house from him. Not because Samuel did anything wrong, not because the house is falling apart, but because the land is worth money to someone who has more money than compassion. My husband will not fight for himself. He never has. He fought for his platoon, he fought for his country, he fought for strangers he never met, but he will not fight for himself because he doesn't believe he's worth fighting for. That's what war did to him. It made him believe that he was expendable. So I am fighting for him with the only thing I have left, which is these words written by a hand that can barely hold a pen. Please, whoever you are, whatever power you have, don't let them take his home. It's the only place in the world where Samuel Torres felt safe. It's the only place where the nightmares couldn't reach him because I was there to wake him up and tell him he was home and the war was over. When I'm gone, the house will have to do that job for me. The walls, the kitchen where I made his coffee, the bedroom where I held him when the memories came back. That house is not property. That house is not real estate. That house is the only thing standing between my husband and the darkness that almost swallowed him before I found him in that cafeteria 37 years ago. Please don't let them take it. Please don't let them take the last place on earth where Samuel Torres is loved. The last word hung in the air like a church bell fading into silence. For 3 full minutes, nobody in that courtroom spoke, nobody moved. The cameras recorded what might be the longest sustained silence in the history of television broadcasting. 3 minutes of absolute stillness, while an entire courtroom full of people sat with the weight of a dead woman's love letter pressing down on their hearts. Judge Judy set the letter down on her bench with trembling hands. She removed her glasses again and wiped her eyes without any attempt to hide the fact that she was crying. Then she did something that nobody had ever seen before and nobody has seen since. She stood up from her bench. She walked down the 3 steps from her elevated position. She crossed the courtroom floor in her black judicial robe, and she walked directly to Samuel Torres and put her arms around him, a judge, embracing a plaintiff on national television. Breaking every rule of judicial decorum that she had upheld for 25 years, and Samuel Torres, Bronze Star veteran, Purple Heart recipient, the man who had maintained military composure through 71 years of hardship, finally broke. He buried his face in his hands and wept. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place so far inside him that it seemed like they had been stored there since Vietnam. Since the homelessness, since Margaret's diagnosis, since the morning he woke up and reached for her on the other side of the bed and found only cold sheets and silence. The audience wept with him, strangers sitting in a television studio holding each other's hands and crying for a man they had never met, but whose story had become their own in the space of 38 minutes. Even Derek Ashland. Even the man who had caused all of this pain sat in his expensive suit, with his head bowed and his hands covering his face. When Judge Judy finally returned to her bench, she took several moments to compose herself. She straightened her robe, she replaced her glasses, she squared her shoulders, and when she spoke her voice carried a force that went beyond judicial authority. It carried moral authority, the kind that comes from genuine human compassion combined with the power to actually do something about injustice. Mr. Ashland. She didn't look at him gently. She looked at him the way a surgeon looks at a tumor. I'm going to render my judgment now, and I want you to listen very carefully because I want every word to be permanently etched in your memory. Your lawsuit against Mr. Torres is dismissed. Completely, entirely. With prejudice, which means you can never file it again. The code violations you used to harass this man and his dying wife were frivolous, retaliatory, and designed to serve no purpose other than pressuring vulnerable people into surrendering their home. Derek's attorney opened his mouth. Judge Judy silenced him with a look that could have stopped a bullet. Furthermore, I am awarding Mr. Torres $50,000 in damages for the legal fees, emotional distress and systematic harassment he has endured from your predatory business practices. And I am formally recommending that the State Attorney General investigate Ashland Premier Properties for a pattern of predatory property acquisition targeting elderly and vulnerable homeowners. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on Derek Ashland with an intensity that made him physically recoil. Mr. Ashland, you are the worst kind of predator. You wear nice suits and carry business cards and hide behind corporate structures, but what you do is no different from a common thief breaking into an old man's house and stealing his most precious possessions. Except what you tried to steal from Samuel Torres wasn't silverware or electronics. You tried to steal the last place on earth where his wife's love still lives. I want you to think about Margaret Torres' letter every time you look at a piece of property and see only dollar signs. I want you to remember that behind every front door is a human story that is worth more than any development deal you will ever close. Now get out of my courtroom. Derek Ashland stood on shaking legs. His expensive suit suddenly looking like a costume, his confidence evaporated like morning dew under a brutal sun. He gathered his leather portfolio and his useless documents and walked toward the exit without making eye contact with anyone. As he reached the courtroom doors, Judge Judy's voice stopped him one final time. And Mr. Ashland, leave that man's house alone. If I hear that you've filed so much as a parking complaint against Samuel Torres, I will personally ensure that every regulatory agency in the state of Arizona takes a very close interest in your business practices. Am I clear? Derek nodded without turning around and walked through the doors into a future that would be significantly less comfortable than the one he had imagined when he walked in. Judge Judy turned back to Samuel Torres, and her voice softened once again into that gentle register that the world had never heard before today. Mr. Torres, your wife Margaret sounds like she was an extraordinary woman. Samuel wiped his eyes with the back of his weathered hand. She was the best person I ever knew, Your Honor. She saved my life, not with medicine but by making me believe that my life was worth saving. Judge Judy nodded slowly. She clearly did. And Mr. Torres, I want you to know something. You are not expendable. Margaret knew that. Everyone in this courtroom knows that. And now everyone watching at home knows it too. You served this country with honor. You deserve to live in peace in the home you shared with the woman who loved you. And as long as I have anything to say about it, that's exactly what you're going to do. Samuel Torres stood at attention. A reflex from decades of military service, his prosthetic leg locked straight, his hand rising in a salute that was directed at Judge Judy, but seemed to encompass something larger, something that included Margaret and the men who never came home from Vietnam, and every veteran who had ever been told their sacrifice wasn't worth remembering. Judge Judy returned the gesture with a simple nod that said everything that needed to be said. The consequences of that courtroom episode rippled outward like a stone thrown into a still lake, except this stone created waves that reached every shore in America. Within 24 hours of the episode airing, the clip of Judge Judy reading Margaret's letter had been viewed 80 million times across YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Within a week the number crossed 200 million. Margaret Torres' letter was printed in full in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and over 300 local newspapers across the country. The hashtag Margaret's letter trended worldwide for 11 consecutive days. Veterans organizations across the nation rallied around Samuel's story. The American Legion, the VFW, the Disabled American Veterans, and dozens of smaller organizations issued public statements condemning the predatory targeting of elderly veterans by property developers. A GoFundMe page set up by viewers without Samuel's knowledge raised $7 million in 72 hours before Samuel asked that donations be redirected to the VA hospital where Margaret had worked for 32 years. He kept only enough to pay off his property taxes and repair the fence that had caused so much trouble. The rest went to Margaret's hospital. The state attorney general launched a formal investigation into Ashland Premier Properties based on Judge Judy's recommendation, and the public outcry generated by the episode. The investigation uncovered a pattern of predatory acquisition targeting elderly homeowners across 3 Arizona counties. Derek Ashland's development license was suspended pending the investigation, and he faced civil suits from 4 former homeowners who came forward after seeing the episode. His $12 million condominium project was permanently canceled by the city council, which cited community opposition and concerns about the developer's ethical practices. 3 members of Congress referenced Margaret's letter during floor speeches about veteran housing protections. A bipartisan bill informally called Margaret's Law was introduced to provide additional legal protections for elderly and disabled veterans facing predatory property acquisition. The bill passed the House with unanimous support and was signed into law 8 months later. Samuel Torres received over 400 Zone letters and cards from people around the world. Veterans, nurses, widows, children, people from every walk of life who had been moved by Margaret's words and Samuel's quiet dignity. He kept every single one in boxes that filled the spare bedroom that he and Margaret had never been able to fill with children. The elementary school where Samuel had worked as a janitor for 28 years renamed its library the Margaret Torres Library, and invited Samuel to cut the ribbon at the dedication ceremony. He wore his army jacket and brought Margaret's letter in his pocket because he said she would have loved knowing that children would read books in a room with her name on it. Judge Judy later said in an interview that the Torres case was the most impactful moment of her entire career, more significant than any legal precedent or landmark ruling. She said Margaret's letter reminded her why she became a judge in the first place. Not to punish people but to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. She kept a copy of the letter framed in her chambers for the remainder of her career. And Samuel Torres. Samuel went home to his little house in Mesa, Arizona. He made himself a cup of coffee in Margaret's kitchen. He sat in Margaret's chair, he held Margaret's letter against his chest, and for the first time in 14 months the house didn't feel empty, because 200 million people had heard Margaret's voice. 200 million people knew her love. And Samuel Torres finally understood what Margaret had been trying to tell him all along. That he was worth fighting for, that he had always been worth fighting for, and that some things in this world are more valuable than any amount of money, more permanent than any building, more powerful than any corporation. Things like a cup of cold soup in a cafeteria at 3 in the morning. Things like a nurse who sat down without being invited. Things like 37 years of coffee and poems and holding hands through nightmares. Things like a letter written by a dying woman who loved a broken soldier so completely that her words could make an entire world cry, and a tough television judge leave her bench and hold a stranger and remember what justice is really supposed to be for. If this story moved you, if Margaret's letter touched something inside your heart that you didn't know was still tender. If Samuel Torres taught you that real strength isn't about power, or money or winning but about enduring and loving, and holding on to the things that matter, even when the whole world is trying to take them away, then I need you to smash that like button right now. Hit it for Samuel, hit it for Margaret, hit it for every veteran who was ever told they were expendable and every nurse who ever sat down across from someone who needed saving. Comment Margaret's letter if this story made you feel something real. Tell me in the comments what part of Margaret's letter hit you the hardest. Was it the cold soup? Was it the nightmares? Was it the line about the house being the only place where Samuel felt safe? I want to know which words broke you because I know some of them did, and subscribe right now because you absolutely must see what's coming next. We're covering the case of a billionaire who tried to demolish a children's hospital to build a parking garage, and the 9-year-old cancer patient who stood up in court and said 7 words that made the billionaire write a check for $50 million on the spot. Trust me, you'll need tissues for that one too. Remember what Margaret Torres taught us: behind every front door is a human story worth more than any amount of money. Behind every faded jacket is a hero worth fighting for, and sometimes the most powerful weapon in a courtroom isn't evidence or arguments or legal precedent. Sometimes it's a letter written on drugstore notebook paper, by a woman who loved a soldier so much that her words could reach through death itself and save his home. This has been the story of Samuel and Margaret Torres, the veteran who wouldn't fight for himself and the wife who fought for him with the only weapon she had left. Share this video with every single person you know who needs to be reminded that love is the most powerful force in any courtroom, in any country, in any lifetime. Justice isn't just served, sometimes justice weeps, sometimes justice steps down from the bench, and sometimes justice holds a trembling old soldier and tells him what his wife always knew, that he is worth it, that he was always worth it.